Hello, my name is Jeremy Larance, and this is my lightning talk about student-led OER, the first scholarly edition of Gene Rhys's The Left Bank and Other Stories. For my sabbatical, I created an online OER British literature anthology. My goal was to make the resources as reliable and scholarly as those offered in traditional textbooks that unfortunately cost a lot of money, which is a little frustrating because anyone who teaches literature knows that so much of what we teach, the text-wise, is in the public domain. What we pay for are things that are written and curated by experts, right? Things like supplemental materials, introductions, annotations, and contextual resources. To make my anthology as rigorous and scholarly as possible, I used grant funding to pay subject matter experts to write things like introductions and footnotes. I also looked for high-quality resources online with appropriate Creative Commons licenses. This chapter on Gothic motifs, for example, was on the British Library page with a Creative Commons license. So I was able to use this and feel pretty confident that the material would be reliable and of high quality. It was while I was working on this project that it occurred to me that this would be a really good class assignment. So when I taught modern British literature, I thought that I could create a class project if I could get enough students interested in doing something that would probably be a little more labor intensive than some of the traditional projects that I would give them. I gave my students a list of works that had recently entered the public domain and asked them to choose one to turn into a scholarly edition. After they looked into things a little bit more and asked me questions and did some research, they selected The Left Bank and Other Stories by Gene Rhys. One of the big draws, they said, was because so many of the stories were really short, some just a few pages long, so they thought that looked a little less daunting. They were also excited, however, by the fact that, as far as we knew, there were no existing scholarly editions. Ours would be the first, and that really excited them, the idea that they could produce something that no one else had done. I had an interesting and interdisciplinary group of students who were interested in this project. Senior English literature major, a junior English rhetoric and writing major, a sophomore English rhetoric and writing major, a junior history major with an English minor, and then a senior media communications major. My media communications major, for example, said, "I like the fact that we will be the first people to ever put out a scholarly edition of this work of literature. That will be cool." And I agreed. I thought it was cool too. One of my English rhetoric and writing majors said that she had a different reason for wanting to create a scholarly edition of this work. She said, "I wanted to vote for a female writer because they have not been represented well in anthologies that we have looked at." And that's true. I had brought in different anthologies at the beginning of the class, and that was something that many of them noted as we were looking at the table of contents. My history major said that Rhys was not his first choice because he wanted to work on Winnie the Pooh. He says, quote, "But I had to admit that there would be more things to annotate in the Rhys stories. I may go back and do Pooh myself." Those are his words, not mine. My English literature major said, "I like that a lot of the stories are short, even for short stories. I saw one that was only a few pages. Not because I think it will be easier, but because I feel like I'll be able to give each story more attention to details, almost like annotating a poem." One of the first hurdles we faced was that we needed a digital copy of the text. There were no electronic versions, not even on Project Gutenberg. We had a hard copy, and then we found a couple of copies online in various forms, including one on the Internet Archive, but we could not copy and paste the text. So the group spent a lot of time using OCR tools, mostly with iPhones actually, to create a text document that they could copy and paste into our publishing platform, which ended up being a platform called PubPub, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. Although it was exhausting, once we had the text, it was relatively easy to create the page. All we had to do was copy and paste the text and paste it into the platform. Once the text was pasted into the site, all I had to do was give each member of the team editorial access. And at that point, they could pretty much do whatever they wanted with the text, including adding annotations and possibly correcting any errors that may have happened during the OCR process. To help guide their editing process, I gave them a key parameter. All footnotes had to be as objective and factual as possible. No personal opinions or interpretations. I asked them to focus on things like basic translations of foreign words or phrases, literary allusions, geographic locations, historical references, and popular culture mentions that might not be familiar to a modern audience. Each student began by reading their assigned stories closely and marking anything they didn't understand, then asking, would a general reader also need clarification here? Once they noted something, they would just simply put the cursor next to the thing they were annotating and then click the footnote button in the platform. So they flagged unfamiliar terms, obscure references, place names, quotes in French. Once students identified items for annotation, they began the research phase. This is where the diversity of the group really paid off. The literature major used scholarly databases and digital archives to trace literary references and provide context for allusions. The rhetoric majors frequently consulted bilingual dictionaries and online translation tools for foreign language phrases and reviewed academic sources to confirm meanings and cultural nuances. Most of the examples in this work were French. The history major searched for historical timelines, obviously, using reputable sources and databases to identify key events, figures, and locations, and he would cross-reference multiple sources for accuracy. The media communications major found that she really liked looking up specific cultural references, films, songs, advertisements that appeared in the text, and checked their origins or popularity at the time of writing. We quickly discovered something that I had not even thought about, but the diversity of the group actually led to some really interesting strengths and outcomes. The history major, for example, left this comment in a post-survey. I'm not going to read the whole thing, you could pause it, but basically a footnote about Napoleon III ended up being the topic of his senior thesis. So out of this one footnote came an even bigger idea that he was able to develop later. My literature major told me that working on annotations helped her become a better reader in her other classes. She was noticing things in text that could or should be annotated, which in turn led to deeper interpretations and better class discussions. And while it may not have been as academically relevant, the media communications major developed a real appreciation for French fashions, especially hats. Turns out Rhys makes several references to different types of hats in her stories. And for what it's worth, I also learned way more than I expected. I found myself incorporating their annotations into my lectures. In fact, their work impressed me so much that I began to question my original guideline that the footnotes should be only objective. I wasn't concerned about the quality of their ideas, it wasn't a matter of trust, but I was still aiming for this to meet the standards of a traditional scholarly edition. This is something I grappled with myself with my own anthology. I knew, for example, that I could write an introduction to Keats's Odes. I've taught those poems for years, but I don't consider myself a Keats expert. And there were other works, many works in my anthology that I didn't feel comfortable writing about at all. So I was very, very concerned about having a scholarly edition, an OER edition that teachers could use reliably in their own classes if it wasn't written and curated by experts. So again, this is where I had to depend on other people when I could. As a class, we looked for resources about what should and should not be in a scholarly edition, and one of the better ones we found was a page from the Modern Language Association, which lists the following 5 characteristics of a scholarly edition: accuracy, adequacy, appropriateness, consistency, and explicitness. They also noted that scholarly editions achieve reliability through a general introduction and explanatory notes tied to specific words, passages, events, or historical figures. These are things that my students were doing, but interestingly, the MLA doesn't say anything about requiring a credentialed expert. But I'll be honest, I couldn't shake the feeling that expert contribution mattered, and I still can't. Anyone attending an open education conference like this already knows that this is one of the major criticisms of OER, the perception that open resources may not be as reliable as commercial ones. For good reason, academics trust materials produced by experts and reviewed by other experts, preferably through some kind of peer review system. Now again, I'm not sure how I stand on this in terms of this anthology, but we all know that is a criticism that is often put out there. This is not a problem that I'm trying to resolve here, but I do want to be transparent that this tension shaped how I framed the project with my students, and it's one that I do think is legitimately worth talking about. After all, the goal here was to let the students lead. This was to be their edition, so this idea of expertise was difficult. In the end, the students themselves were more adamant than I was that they wanted to bring an expert in to give their scholarly edition, in their words, legitimacy. And the simplest way that they thought that they could accomplish this would be to find someone willing to write an introduction. We did not have a grant for this project, so we did not have the luxury of offering a scholar a stipend to write that introduction for us. But, as luck would have it, I knew a Caribbean literature scholar who has written about and taught Jean Rhys, and she was more than happy to help and worked with the students to write an introduction to the collection of short stories. Now, unfortunately, I have to end my presentation on a bit of a sad note. As I said, we used a platform called PubPub to create our scholarly edition of Jean Rhys's The Left Bank and Other Stories. PubPub was a free community-driven publishing platform funded by a nonprofit. I used the past tense was because just as we were finishing our first draft, PubPub announced that it would be shutting down. We will still publish our edition of Rhys's stories. There are plenty of options, but none are quite as dynamic. Still, I've been able to share digital copies with others, including a few educators who plan to use some of the stories in their courses. The experience was invaluable for me, even though I still don't have a clear answer to my questions about how scholarly an open resource really needs to be. Regardless, my students loved the project, and I probably enjoyed it even more than they did. I'll absolutely be doing similar projects moving forward.